Dean Ambrose, who is now better known as Jon Moxley in AEW, was once one of WWE's most beloved and unpredictable characters. His time as a member of The Shield and his subsequent solo run under the Dean Ambrose name cemented his place as one of the most entertaining and intriguing wrestlers of his generation. However, when he made the jump to All Elite Wrestling, AEW, in 2019, his transformation into Jon Moxley wasn't the meteoric success many had anticipated. Instead, Moxley's tenure in AEW showcased both highs and notable lows. There were several reasons why Moxley's evolution from WWE's Dean Ambrose to AEW's Jon Moxley failed to hit the mark for some fans, and understanding these reasons requires a deeper look at the factors that shaped his transition. Firstly, there's the matter of the hype. When Jon Moxley left WWE, the wrestling world buzzed with excitement. Ambrose had been a beloved character, known for his chaotic personality and his ability to get under the skin of opponents and audiences alike. When he revealed his departure, fans eagerly speculated about how the Lunatic Fringe would translate into AEW. Moxley had promised fans a more real version of himself, saying goodbye to WWE's corporate constraints and embracing a rawer, grittier persona. The anticipation was huge, with many expecting Moxley to be AEW's version of a reborn superstar, one who would break out of the confines of what was previously expected from him in WWE. However, when Moxley first appeared in AEW, it wasn't the instant hit that many had hoped for. His debut was certainly shocking, and he made an immediate impact by attacking Chris Jericho and Kenny Omega in an explosive debut. But as the months went on, Moxley's character and booking began to show some cracks. While his style was undoubtedly more aggressive and hardcore than it had been in WWE, it wasn't long before some fans began to feel that his AEW run wasn't delivering on the promise of his newfound freedom. One of the primary reasons why Jon Moxley struggled in AEW can be attributed to how he was presented in the company. Moxley's WWE persona was based heavily around chaos, unpredictability, and instability. His antics were designed to make him appear untamable, always willing to take risks and engage in reckless violence. However, in AEW, much of this unpredictability felt scripted or forced. AEW fans, who were used to the high-flying, athletic spectacle that defined much of the promotion, found Moxley's brawling style to be out of place at times. He was positioned as an anti-hero, but his character often felt at odds with the environment around him. Another issue was Moxley's booking. While WWE had certainly never booked Ambrose as a top-tier champion, the character had been a significant part of the show during his time with the company. By contrast, Moxley's AEW booking often lacked the consistency that could make him feel like a real top star. While he won the AEW World Championship early in his tenure with the company, his reign was marked by a series of odd choices that muddied his persona. In particular, his matches with the likes of MJF and other top-tier AEW talent felt overbooked or too convoluted, detracting from his impact. Moxley's match with MJF at AEW Revolution 2020, for example, was widely considered a missed opportunity. The match had all the potential to be a classic, given the history between the two characters, but the match ultimately didn't live up to the hype. This felt especially disappointing when compared to some of Moxley's previous rivalries in AEW, which had felt more organic and less forced. While Moxley's chemistry with Jericho had been compelling and felt natural, his feud with MJF in particular felt strained and lacking in depth. This lack of compelling storytelling resulted in a series of underwhelming matches, contributing to Moxley's failure to fully connect with the AEW audience in the way that many had hoped. Another factor that contributed to Moxley's difficulties in AEW was the lack of a strong, consistent rival. In WWE, Ambrose's rivalries with the likes of Seth Rollins, Roman Reigns, and Bray Wyatt were what truly brought his character to life. These intense and emotional feuds helped to shape his identity as a wild, unpredictable figure who was always ready to take on the world. In AEW, however, Moxley's biggest rivalries, particularly his program with Chris Jericho, lacked the same level of depth and personal stakes. The absence of a truly defining feud prevented Moxley from connecting with fans on a deeper level. Moxley's decision to leave WWE was a personal one, and it didn't happen overnight. In the years leading up to his exit, there were multiple instances where he publicly expressed dissatisfaction with his position in WWE. He had spent years under WWE's stringent creative system, which is known for sometimes limiting the wrestler's ability to truly showcase their full potential. Many wrestlers, especially those who began their careers outside of WWE's developmental system, have struggled with this. Moxley, as an example, had a background in the independent scene before joining WWE's developmental territory, FCW, and later NXT. He had made a name for himself through his intense, unpredictable style, something that made him stand out in the crowded wrestling landscape. Once he made it to WWE, Moxley quickly became a fan favorite as part of the Shield, a faction that dominated the main roster for years. However, behind the scenes, Moxley was growing increasingly frustrated with WWE's creative direction. His time as Dean Ambrose, particularly the last few years, seemed to showcase a wrestler who was somewhat boxed in by a system that didn't always allow him to display his full range of talents. Moxley was reportedly unhappy with how his character was being handled, particularly in the aftermath of his rivalry with Seth Rollins in 2018, which didn't resonate as strongly as they had hoped. He was also said to be disillusioned with the scripting of his promos, a major sticking point for him since he was known for his improvisational skills and raw, unscripted delivery. In early 2019, Moxley's frustrations came to a head. He made the shocking decision not to renew his WWE contract, and when his contract expired, he made his departure known. This decision left WWE scrambling to figure out how to move forward without one of its top talents. The most significant thing to remember here is that Moxley's decision wasn't about money. He had the option to stay in WWE, but he chose not to because of creative differences. This speaks to the heart of why many believe WWE hates him, as they could have easily kept him under their umbrella with a lucrative contract. But Moxley wanted more than just financial compensation. He wanted creative freedom, and WWE was unwilling to give him that. This set the stage for Moxley's shift to AEW, a company founded in 2019 that offered a more flexible, talent-friendly approach to storytelling. AEW was built on the idea that wrestlers would have more input into their characters and creative direction, and this was a perfect fit for someone like Moxley, who had grown disillusioned with WWE's restrictive environment. Moxley's debut in AEW was nothing short of monumental. He arrived at AEW's Double or Nothing pay-per-view in May 2019, taking out Chris Jericho and Kenny Omega in the process. His sudden arrival was a sign that AEW wasn't just going to be another wrestling promotion. It was going to be a place where the wrestlers had more control over their careers, and Moxley was one of the biggest stars to embrace this shift. In conclusion, while Jon Moxley's move to AEW was widely anticipated and initially promising, a combination of booking choices, underwhelming feuds, limited character development, and the company's growing roster created a situation where Moxley's potential wasn't fully realized. While he remained a valuable and competent performer, the chaotic energy that made Dean Ambrose so memorable in WWE didn't quite translate into the same level of success in AEW. Fans may still appreciate Moxley for his contributions to AEW, but it's clear that his time in the promotion didn't live up to the full expectations of his potential. Additionally, the reliance on hardcore matchups and deathmatch-style contests often seemed like a crutch rather than a strength for Moxley. While hardcore wrestling was undoubtedly a big part of his appeal, it sometimes felt like AEW was leaning too heavily into the gimmick at the expense of showcasing his full range as a performer. Instead of focusing on Moxley's more technical side or his ability to engage in psychological warfare, AEW frequently turned to blood-soaked brawls and extreme stipulation matches to maintain Moxley's relevance. This approach began to feel repetitive, and eventually alienated fans who wanted more substance to his matches. In a company like AEW, where the focus on in-ring wrestling is paramount, Moxley's tendency to rely on brawling and chaotic violence often felt out of place, especially when compared to the precision of wrestlers like Kenny Omega, Hangman Page, or even Darby Allin. While Moxley could hold his own in these types of matches, it often seemed like he wasn't being booked to his full potential as a technical wrestler or storyteller. His hardcore persona began to feel more like a limitation than an asset, preventing him from fully connecting with the audience. In AEW, where there was an increasing focus on more well-rounded wrestlers. Furthermore, the pressure to maintain the lone wolf persona, one that had defined his Ambrose character in WWE, ultimately limited Moxley's options in AEW. While the character of Jon Moxley was presented as someone who thrived in isolation, this approach restricted his potential for growth within the promotion. In AEW, where factions and partnerships are key to many storylines, Moxley's refusal to align himself with other wrestlers or to form lasting friendships kept him on the periphery of the main storylines. This made it harder for fans to invest in his journey or view him as an integral part of AEW's bigger picture. This trend of isolation continued throughout his AEW tenure. Moxley's reluctance to join factions or form alliances meant that he was often left to fend for himself in a company that relied heavily on group dynamics. While his individualism was a key part of his character's identity, it also made it difficult for him to build the same kind of multi-layered storylines that other top stars in AEW were able to develop. His inability or refusal to forge meaningful relationships with other wrestlers hampered his growth in AEW, especially when compared to the likes of Kenny Omega, Chris Jericho, or even Adam Page, who were able to use their alliances to fuel their stories. Another aspect of Moxley's AEW run that failed to fully captivate audiences was his character development. While Moxley was often portrayed as a dangerous, rebellious figure, he lacked the complexity and layers that other AEW stars were afforded. Characters like Hangman Page, who underwent significant growth and transformation over the course of his storylines, demonstrated the kind of depth that Moxley's character often lacked. Instead of evolving or showcasing a more nuanced side of himself, Moxley's persona in AEW remained relatively static. The absence of character growth made it harder for fans to stay invested in his journey, especially when his storylines began to feel repetitive or disconnected from the larger narrative arcs of the company. Finally, the rise of AEW's roster presented its own challenges for Moxley. With so many new, exciting talents emerging, Moxley began to fade into the background as the company's emphasis shifted toward developing younger stars. While Moxley was still positioned as a top-tier talent, his matches began to feel less special as AEW continued to sign high-profile wrestlers like CM Punk, Bryan Danielson, and Adam Cole. The influx of fresh talent created an environment where Moxley's star power was diminished, as fans began to focus more on the new faces rather than those who had been part of the company's original wave. Moxley's failure to stand out in this crowded field ultimately contributed to his less-than-ideal run in AEW. There has been speculation since Moxley left, and although he's since signed with All Elite Wrestling, AEW, his WWE history continues to be a talking point. The relationship between Moxley and WWE has been tumultuous at best, and it's important to understand why things soured between them, as well as why many believe WWE hates him. To answer the question of whether Moxley will return to WWE, we need to look at both his career trajectory since leaving the company and the circumstances of his departure.